So what's going on, guys? Welcome back to the podcast. Today we've got another great guest on. So he is a clinical professor in the field of psychiatry. He's also the author of the viral Medium article Dopamine 2.0 and a coach to CEOs and VCs in Silicon Valley for optimal health and performance, Dr. Cameron Sepah. How you doing?
I'm great. Great to be with you today.
Amazing. And Cameron, for the audience that may not know who you are, do you just want to give a brief overview of yourself and kind of your work?
Sure, yeah. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I have specialties in anxiety disorders and behavioral medicine. So I used to work in hospital settings, treating, veterans with PTSD, treating patients that have like obesity and diabetes and other chronic health conditions, address it from a behavioral point of view. And I'm also a clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCSF School of Medicine, where I train the psychiatrists there. So I come from kind of a traditional academic clinical background. A few years ago, I actually moved out to Silicon Valley and became a healthcare entrepreneur. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to basically help as many people as possible. And I realized that a lot of the issues that we're facing as a country are such an epidemic, such as the obesity, diabetes crisis. You're not going to treat it one patient at a time. So I helped start a company called Omada Health that basically creates online weight loss programs to help people avoid diabetes, helped 400,000 people lose 4 million pounds, and just realized that technology can be, a really double-edged sword. Obviously, it can do a lot of bad, but it can also do a lot of good if we use it in the right ways. And that's how I kind of fell in love with entrepreneurship. So now my main gig, I still have a private practice. I still teach, but I'm the full-time CEO of Maximus, which is a consumer telemedicine company that helps men be better in mind and body.
Amazing. And I'm actually part of the Maximus Tribe group, so I've signed up, and the Facebook group's great. It's a fantastic community. And I think it's great for kind of men. And we'll definitely touch on masculinity a little bit later in the podcast. But firstly, I want to start with kind of dopamine fasting, because I came across yourself on Twitter from the article that you wrote on Medium, which kind of went viral all around the world. And to me at the time, it was a very new concept, right? This idea of dopamine fasting. It's become very trendy now in especially Silicon Valley and kind of within kind of the entrepreneur and tech space. So for the audience, like, what is dopamine fasting first and foremost?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it was kind of a funny phenomenon. I wrote the article in, I think, of last year, because I wanted to actually very much just like what I was talking about entrepreneurship, take an evidence-based intervention and bring it to the masses. Because not everyone, unfortunately, has the time or energy or resources to do therapy with a mental health care professional. And also, the reality is issues are on a spectrum, right? When we talk about addiction, for instance, obviously there are some people who have a significant severity of addiction that it's causing them social or occupational impairment, right? They're not able to do their jobs, or obviously getting in the way of their relationships. Otherwise, though, everyone is can kind of be somewhere on the spectrum in terms of mild or maybe even a moderate problem. May not even necessarily warrant full clinical treatment, but it's taking up unnecessary time, and they could be doing better things. And so it really came out of my practice because psychologists like myself, we're used to treating addictions like substance abuse and dependent issues, obviously alcohol, other sort of drugs. But I was actually noticing more and more in my practice, especially because I work with tech CEOs, there was this increasing rise in what I call behavioral addictions. So not just drug use or alcohol use, but problematic behaviors, I would say, that were getting in the way of people's lives. The most common of which, of course, is internet and gaming, right? Which, as anyone with a smartphone unfortunately knows, can be incredibly addictive. And in fact, in the DSM, internet gaming disorder is now a recognized mental health condition. And we know that because especially in China and South Korea or other areas that where it's a lot more common. There's guys spending 10, 12 hours a day, unfortunately, addicted to these video games, and it is actually impairing their health. So that's one category. Obviously, pornography, masturbation, sexual addiction is on the rise. We're seeing that kind of behavior. Gambling and shopping are, of course, classic sort of addictive behaviors that both men and women do. There's the huge rise in binge eating, which is obviously contributing to the obesity epidemic. And there's also like thrill novelty seeking as well. So people who are adrenaline junkies, thrill seekers, etc. So all of these things, even though you're not sort of popping a pill or injecting a substance, can quite frankly be as addictive, certainly on a psychological perspective, even if there isn't the physiological dependence along with it. And from an impairment standpoint and a distress standpoint, can certainly bother people and cause significant impairments in their quality of life, just as much as, quite frankly, drugs can. So I was seeing the rise of this in my practice, and of course, using evidence-based techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, to treat them. But the issue is there's a little bit of an interesting nuance when it comes to sort of these digital addictions, like I was talking about. So, for instance, if you have a heroin problem, obviously there's no need to take heroin. Some people, of course, not that they should, but do quit some substances. Maybe a better analogy is like smoking, right? People quit smoking or cigarettes cold turkey because there's no biological need for us to use it. And I would argue there's probably not even as much of a social need, certainly if you're in California where it's banned in bars and restaurants and it actually hurts your dating to be a smoker nowadays. There's no social need to smoke as well. However, with the internet, that's not the case. We obviously can't go cold turkey. Almost anyone who's a student or at least a white collar professional basically needs to use the computer or the internet. So abstinence only models just generally don't really work. And unfortunately, if you do have a problem or problematic use with the internet, the question is, how can you live with the internet? And that's where the whole impetus for dopamine fasting came from, which is how can I, reduce or manage these kind of impulsive or compulsive addictive behaviors, but still I got to use it for other reasons. And so the idea, if you're, obviously your audience may be familiar with intermittent fasting, right? As a dietary protocol to help people sort of manage overeating, because we probably weren't designed to eat 24 hours a day, right? We kind of came up with an arbitrary 3 meals a day, or I don't know, bodybuilders do 6 meals a day these days. And so it can help people to do what's called time restricted eating, or TRE, where you keep it within an 8 or 12-hour window, eat obviously high quality food, but your body needs a break. And it's the same thing, quite frankly, for our brains. Our brains need a break from all these digital devices. And so basically the idea of dopamine fasting is not, by the way, to fast from dopamine in and of itself. Dopamine is not harmful. It's a necessary neurotransmitter. In fact, if you don't have dopamine, or have problems with dopamine, you see that commonly in conditions like Parkinson's or ADHD. So it's not that dopamine is the devil, so to speak. It's the problem. The problem is really it's dopamine mediated behaviors that are the problem. And so what I mean by that is, I'll give you a concrete example. If you've never had a smartphone before, right, and you start using it, you start noticing these little notifications pop up on your screen. It's a little red dot that's like, oh, hey, you got a new message, right, from a loved one. And before, that red dot didn't really mean anything to you, but you quickly learn, oh, that means I got a little reward coming, right? I got this little juicy text message or information or new news article. And so we start to associate it, and through classical conditioning, get a positive reward or positive reinforcement from it. And in fact, what the tricky part that happens is often what do? We grab for our phones, not just for positive reinforcement, but for negative reinforcement, because we're bored, we're angry, we're lonely, we're tired, we're stressed, and we don't like feeling that way. And we want that distraction. And so essentially we're getting this double reinforcement that's happening, right? It's making the bad feelings go away, and it's providing good feelings because we got this bit of novelty from it as well. And so that's unfortunately what's happened and made us all addicts, I would argue, is this double reinforcement of conditioning with our smartphone, digital devices, and internet has essentially made it very, very tricky and almost unconscious that we reach for and seek these things when we're feeling bad, and we compulsively stay on it for excessive periods of time through infinite scrolling because it is numbing us, distracting us, and helping us avoid these sort of negative emotions. And obviously, if we're doing this all throughout the day, you can imagine the negative effects it has on your attention, your focus, your mood, and getting in the way of course, you doing healthier, more positive things with your behavior and time, right? And so that's the need for us to not necessarily engage in this constant, it's almost like snacking for your mind, right? We need our brains and our bodies sort of need to take breaks. So the protocol for what's the solution to all this is dopamine fasting. And dopamine fasting basically has what I call a fasting schedule and a feasting schedule. So the fasting schedule is just like we're doing with intermittent fasting, is you set up times to take a break, right? So this is almost like common sense, but the reality is sometimes when you structure it and you schedule it, it's easier for people to do. So I actually recommend essentially prolonged periods of fasting. So on a daily basis, at minimum, I would say take an hour break before you go to sleep at night. And this is, I've seen this to be incredibly beneficial with my clients and my patients, is if you even leave that hour gap, your ability to fall asleep, or what we call your sleep latency, improves tremendously. Versus if you're literally scrolling Twitter right before you go to bed, you shut off your eyes and try to go to bed, your brain's still very stimulated at that point. It's hard to kind of unwind down. So I actually recommend 1 to even 4 hours at the end of every day to stay away from impulsive, compulsive internet use. Secondarily, I do recommend 1 day off a week. So typically a Saturday is most feasible for most people. There's a nice little Barstool Sports Saturdays for the boys motto where I recommend Saturdays for life. Like get offline and do something else and just take a little bit of a break. I do recommend 1 weekend a quarter where maybe like, go somewhere, do something else, get outside, go camping, and just get away from that. And even 1 week a year. So obviously people take vacations annually. That might be a good time to do a little bit of unwinding, dopamine detox, if you want to call it that, and just take a little bit of these prolonged breaks. And the idea is it allows for better recuperation and recovery by sort of scheduling these breaks. Now, the feasting schedule is obviously if you're, let's say, taking 1 to 4 hours off at the end of every day, doesn't mean that you should be on the internet all day. So it depends on what the behavior is. Obviously, if it's checking text messages or emails, you might need to do that a couple times a day. It's required for your school or work. I understand that. But if there's things that are not so necessary, let's say, Twitter or social media, most people probably shouldn't be using it for more than, I would say, 30 to 60 minutes a day. And so that's where it may be helpful to schedule that time and say, okay, I'm going to use app limits, screen time limits. These are actually now built into iOS or the iPhone function where you can limit it to 30 to 60 minutes, or schedule it yourself and just say, okay, after work, I'm going to use it for 30 to 60 minutes. It's going to be between the time of 6 and 7 p.m. I can indulge all I want, but the moment 7 o'clock comes across, the alarm bell rings, I'm going to stop myself and I'm going to, go on with the rest of my day. So it's kind of programmatically allowing structure and boundaries to our use so that it doesn't become excessive and compulsive like we're seeing so much nowadays.
That's a great explanation, and it's very true, isn't it? It's one of those things I think sort of seeps up on people, right? They don't realize they're spending that much time on social media, and then that is actually having a negative effect on relationships and just interpersonal relationships. If you look at, when you see a group of guys go out, right, and they're supposed to be having fun with their buddies or talking to some girls, you see them just just at the side of the bar on their phone. And, from a relationship standpoint, that's not great. It's not great for the interaction. Then also from a productivity standpoint, there's so much time wasted that you're not putting towards something that could be useful. And I think especially for the audience that's listening, these guys, very busy guys that work a lot, if you're working a lot and then you're jumping straight back onto that phone for the rest of the day up until the evening, this is going to ruin your sleep. Like you said, the latency of your sleep, the deep and REM sleep, again, which is so important for your recovery and, for forming your memories and things like that, which I think is super important. And regarding kind of dopamine fasting from pornography, is that something that you think is a big problem at the minute with guys that you kind of work with and things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, it varies for each individual. And the thing that's important to point out, and I say this both with substances and for behaviors, it's not the substance or the behavior that's the problem. It's the habit, right? Yeah. So like, it's the same thing. It's like, people know this with alcohol. If you have a drink once a month, it causes you no problems. Is it really problematic? No, of course not. Obviously, if you're a daily drinker, right, and it's causing you, significant problems, or, you're getting a DUI, or if you're a caffeine addict and the day that you go without it, you get major headaches and you have physiological dependence, that's when it's a problem. So I would argue it's the same for pornography, right? Like you use it once in a blue moon. There's nothing wrong intrinsically. Same thing with masturbation. In fact, there's some evidence that suggests it actually may help prostate function, at least, or orgasm and seminal release. So this not intrinsically bad or harmful. I want to convey that message. It's the habit, it's the compulsiveness and what it's causing that's the problem, right? Unfortunately, it is problematic for a lot of guys, and we're seeing this, right? People are self-reporting this, that, for instance, they're spending hours, a week. It's an excessive amount. It feels like it's out of control, like they don't have control over it. Whenever I hear that from someone that I'm working with, they're like, I don't have reign over this. Then I'm like, okay, this is when it's starting to be problematic. or it's causing impairments in their relationships, right? Like these are guys who may be able to, in fact, get sex from a healthy partnership. They're so kind of hooked into the tantalizing, the fantasy aspect of pornography that they're not actually spending in a healthy sexual relationship. Or they're so addicted to pornography that they're not seeking a healthy relationship because they're getting that need met, but it's obviously not fulfilling in a long-term way as you'd be getting it from obviously a healthy sexual, intimate, relationship that has an emotional aspect of it as well. So unfortunately, yes, because of broadband internet and the proliferation of pornography, for people who are either have a little bit more addictive personalities, or quite frankly, they're dealing with something else and it's a way to numb it. It's becoming definitely more and more of a problem. So I think if that's the case, and like I said, the two kind of hallmarks for me are distress. Does it bother you? Right? If it doesn't bother you, then fine. And second, is it impairing? Is it causing a problem in your social or your work? And if it is, then okay, maybe you need to cut back a little bit. And that could be try to do it on your own, try to do it in the context of a supportive group. That's why we launched these communities. You can go to bemaximus.com. You can join our tribes. And so like, for instance, right now we're doing a obsolete October challenge where if you have a bad habit that you want to make obsolete or overcome, let's say pornography, you can join a group. And every day you can check in and have an accountability buddy. And obviously, if it's more severe than that, and you're like, okay, this is really, really a problem, absolutely go see a licensed mental health professional if you feel like it's like a real addictive, issue and you can't deal with it on your own.
For sure. That makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. It's the frequency and kind of the severity of the habit, right, that causes the issue. It's not the vice itself, because there are vices everywhere. And I'll even say myself, we all indulge in certain vices at certain times, whether that's alcohol, whether that's food. And it is just the degree to which that is becoming a detriment to your life is kind of what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the thing that people miss is the opportunity cost. I talk to people all the time, and there's a similar refrain. And by the way, I'm guilty of this myself. We're all too busy, right? But if
Yeah.
you sit there and actually do a time audit, and I actually do this occasionally with clients, and I'll say, let's not change anything. All I want to do is understand, how do you spend your time, right? So basically on an hourly basis every day, just tell me what the hell you're doing, right? And then come in at the end of the week and let's take a look at your weekly calendar and see how you spent it. And then we'll add up the times, right? People are blown away by how much time they waste. The reality is they are busy, but what they're busy with is that basically every waking hour is filled up with something, and often it is like digital or distracting or not useful, basically. And I'll give you a concrete example of this that came out of the research. So they had college students essentially do a version of dopamine fasting, where they said, hey, quit Facebook for a week and let's see what happens to your life. The interesting thing is they found they were using Facebook. People didn't realize this, 13.3 hours a week, right? It's almost 2 hours a day that the average college student uses Facebook. And if you're thinking about it, you're like, okay, I'm going to school, obviously taking care of my showering and hygiene and other functions. You don't have a ton of free time left. So let's say you have 4 hours of free time, maybe up to 8 hours of free time a day. If two of those are spent online, then yes, you are busy, because every kind of downtime that you have is essentially taken up by the constant digital distraction. So they had one group, they randomized them and said, you keep on doing what you're doing. The other group, randomly assigned, fast, essentially withdraw from Facebook for a week. So not only did they save, obviously, 13.3 hours that they were previously wasting, without the scientists actually telling them anything, they spontaneously started engaging in more health behaviors, right? They started cooking more meals, started going to the gym more often, not because anyone told them to, because they just found this magical time that they thought they were busy, right? And never had before. The other interesting effect that came out of this study is they reduced their depressive symptomatology by 17%, right? The other thing that's very pernicious that people don't realize is it has a negative effect on your mood when we're not even conscious of it, right? Most people really don't feel better on social media. What we feel is not worse, right? Because you're dealing with boredom or loneliness or whatever it is, the feeling that you're dealing with. And yes, it distracts you, because then I'm like, oh man, look at that Donald Trump outrage article that I encountered with. So it distracts us from that negative feeling, but it replaces it with another negative feeling, which is I went from bored to outraged, right? And then I walk away from it and I'm like, do I actually feel better? No, I feel distracted, but I'm not walking away feeling more happy, fulfilled, connected, which is what people actually want to feel in their lives. like social media for the most part is a net negative. I would actually argue for most people, unless they're very, very controlled about how they use it. If it's very thoughtful, it can be. Obviously, there's great people. That's how we got connected, right, through social media. So I'm not saying it's an evil, but it definitely, just like any other addictive substance, needs to be used in moderation, very thoughtfully, right? So it's just kind of like, yeah, if you're having a glass of wine with dinner or a cup of coffee in the morning and it's manageable and reasonable, yes, it can actually be neutral to maybe even slightly health positive. And I would argue the social media use and other sort of addictive behaviors is the same way. So if you have to be thoughtful about it, and dopamine fasting provides you with a thoughtful structure so that provides control of your life, and so it doesn't take over like we're seeing today.
That's really interesting, and I can relate to that. I think it actually crosses a really good parallel with kind of food tracking, like what you said there with kind of time tracking with what you're doing. It's the same as with tracking your food, right? Because most of the time, you actually, if you don't track, if you're not that aware of kind of what you're actually putting in your body, you're actually probably eating a lot more than you think, right? And it's the same with your time when it comes to kind of social media and dopamine. You're spending a lot more time than you probably think on this dopamine. If you actually track it and you're a bit more accountable around it, you'll actually be quite shocked by how much it's taken up your life.
Absolutely. And like I said, you'll find this ancillary benefit of how much better you're feeling, how much better you're sleeping, and how much better your connections are. It's interesting when I talk particularly to young people, I would say Generation Z, there's almost this inability to be bored. I'm thank God I'm a little bit older and I didn't have a cell phone until I was 18. So I feel like my brain wasn't ruined. Now it's ruined. But at least it developmentally wasn't sort of ruined. I do notice a generational difference in the ability to like actually be present in a conversation and stay focused, right? And even have down times in the conversation. Like, can you sit there in silence, right? I don't think a lot of young people are used to these things, right? And so, but when you start withdrawing from these things, or at least taking a little bit more breaks, like I said, like let's say on Saturdays you're taking a little, digital break from the internet, you do notice that it's different. At first, you get almost antsy because you're like, where's that stimulation that I'm used to? It's just like if you were drinking coffee Monday through Friday, Saturday you wake up, you're like, oh, I'm groggy. I'm not used to that stimulation that I'm used to. But once you kind of get back to that equilibrium, you're like, oh, okay, this is what it's like to re-engage, to feel fully connected when I'm having a conversation. I slow down a little bit. My tone of voice changes. I can feel the dynamic of being with this other person and feeling actually emotionally connected with them. That's the subtle and parts of it that I think are also particularly beneficial.
100%. And I think it makes you much more present. And that's going to have, like you said, a great effect on your relationships, but also kind of your work and overall calmness and reduction of anxiety, I'd say. And I've definitely felt that personally, which I think is great. That's awesome. I think dopamine fasting is great. What I wanted to touch on now and move on to is kind of COVID. And obviously, that has been a big topic of this year. And a big kind of question that a lot of people have debated, especially on Twitter, which me and you've obviously seen, is the mask debate, right? And should we be wearing a mask? Should it be an anti-masker? What are we doing? And obviously, you as professional and a professor have your own view on this. So, do you want to kind of share a little bit around kind of the mask debate and your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. And I want to talk more about the psychology of it, right?
Sure.
I don't think there's, quite frankly, a dispute about the efficacy of masks. It's almost like if you're saying, like, is there a dispute about the efficacy of vaccines? Not really. Vaccines are the most effective medical intervention in history, right? We've eradicated polio and other things that were terrible scourges that unfortunately people have a very short memory for. I actually encourage people, go on YouTube and search about polio and like an iron lung and what it was like to get treatment for polio back in the your grandparents had to deal with for these people who are like against vaccinations. We are very, very blessed that you're born in a first world industrialized country for the most part of the people who are listening to this in a time period where you're not going to die of an infectious disease for the most part. You're going to survive long enough into adulthood. This is the first time, in fact, in history where we're more likely to die of lifestyle issues like obesity and diabetes than we are of infectious diseases. And that's a testament to, quite frankly, modern medicine, vaccines and antibiotics, right? So we know for the most part they work. They're not perfect. Obviously, like the flu vaccine, the reason it's not 100% is there's so many different flu varieties. And it's the same thing when we have a coronavirus vaccine. We'll see what the efficacy is, but obviously they're not going to release it unless it is efficacious. It's the same thing with masks. Look, uh, I always ask people who are anti-mask, like if you were getting a surgery, right? And would you want your surgeon to wear a mask if he's like, you're cut open, like your chest is open, he's like doing heart surgery on you? Most people would, because they know that like infection and like the germ theory is valid, right? And there's no controversy around that. Of course, you want someone when you're in a vulnerable situation to wear a mask because it protects you. The unfortunate thing is that the mask issue has become politicized, right? When the funny thing is, when I ask people, like, are you pro-mask, are you anti-mask? It almost inevitably correlates to their political point of view and which president their presidential candidate they're voting for. Which to me, I'm like, this is really silly. This is not a scientific or medical issue. Unfortunately, because of politics, it's become a politicized issue around sort of freedom, right? But here's the thing that I especially say to guys, because unfortunately, it is more men I think that are a little bit more averse. Not a time, I would say a little bit more so. Is it's become an anti-masculine thing, mask wearing, right? But the admonition I always say is masks are manly, man. Like, think about all the professions that wear masks. First of all, surgeons, which is a super masculine profession, they're all wearing masks. Nobody gives them shit for wearing masks. If you're a construction or oil worker, you're often wearing masks to protect you from like, sawdust or coal, in the air. They're wearing masks. Soldiers are obviously wearing helmet and gas masks to protect them from threats. And then even professional athletes or football players essentially wearing a face mask to prevent them from wearing it. We don't consider that any less than, any less manly, any like imposition on their freedom. And they don't complain about it. They're like, look, it's a safety thing. You can't be in the construction yard unless you're wearing steel-toed boots, a helmet, and a mask if it's necessary, right? It's for your own safety and good. Nobody complains, nobody protests because they know it's in their own interest. Unfortunately, because it's been this, big government is pressing this on you issue, that people feel like a threat to their sense of autonomy. Now, we know from psychology, people don't like being told what to do, right? And because it's been politicized and messaged in that way, it's like, we're stripping your freedom, we're stripping your autonomy away. That's when people are pushing back. And we know this because we've dealt with this in 1920. This is not the first time we've had a pandemic. People have similarly protested around it. But unfortunately, this is what I would say, like, let's take the politics out of it. If you think about yourself as a human being, which is like, look, if you take this sort of issue aside, it's more likely to protect you, obviously, from wearing a mask, especially if you're in close quarters with other people, especially indoors. Outdoors is a different issue, right? I think that's a fair debate about whether you need to wear it outdoors in bright sunshine and free circulation. But if you're in an indoor space, there's a ton of people, there's no air circulation, then yeah, I think the evidence is pretty clear. You should do it to protect yourself. And if not, you should do it to protect other people. Unfortunately, because of the asymptomatic nature of COVID, it's not always clear who has it and who doesn't. You can't just rely on how you're feeling. And so it's just probably the right thing to do. But I think the way that we get people to do it is we depoliticize it and we rebrand it and say, look, mask wearing is always been masculine. In fact, most of the people wear it are men, because men are the people who are doing dangerous jobs, quite frankly, right? All the jobs that I had mentioned. And nobody considers them less than a puppet or less manly because of that, right? In fact, it's like a status symbol to be wearing a helmet or a mask or have a surgical mask or wearing scrubs. So I think if we rebrand it in a positive way, people will become a little bit more open to it, hopefully.
Yeah, for sure. Because obviously the science backs it. I do think that the government should have made it more cool, right? By, I don't know, getting some cool influencers or like David Beckham or some celeb to push it. Man, everyone would want to wear the mask then. You know what I mean?
And I think, look, leadership starts on the top. Quite frankly, if the United States had a leader who would wear their mask regularly and just said, "Hey, like this is the right thing to do," and in fact, for the people who are anti-lockdown, it would reduce the likelihood or probability or the duration of the lockdowns, right? So this is a nuance that people miss on social media, right? Everything is a trade-off. Where, for instance, if we're doing more testing, more tracing, and more masks, it would actually probably reduce the need for lockdown, which is the real imposition of freedom, in my opinion, which we probably should debate about how much of a lockdown that we should do. I don't think there's a debate about masks. I do think there's a debate about lockdowns. But ironically, if you do one, you're more likely to be able to have freedom around the other, right? So people should think about it this way, is that there's also a trade-off, right? And that the more safety precautions, prevention that we take, it actually may give you more freedom in the end.
Yeah, for sure. And you touched on a good point there, lockdown. So, what is your view as someone that is a psychiatrist and a mental health expert? What do you think is the right strategy when it comes to the lockdowns and combating kind of mental health issues that we're kind of seeing with people?
Yeah, I'm a psychologist and psychiatry professor, so I have sort of opinions about public policy, and I think it's a fair debate. But the part that I think I'm better suited to address is the mental health implications of lockdowns, right? So obviously, there's a trade-off. Like this is what I was saying. This is why public health. There's no right answer, right? And this is the thing that people miss too. It's like it's that science is not always perfect, right? We have the best evidence that we have. We take sort of and people can have differing opinions, right? There's no always scientific consensus. For certain things there are, where it's like a home run, great. But when it's a little bit more debatable, like is the lockdown the right thing? There's going to be people on different sides of the aisle and have different points of view on it. I think the thing that's missed a little bit is the mental health implications of the lockdowns, where restricting people's freedom of travel, restricting people's freedom of access to outdoor environments, and particularly exercise, I think is having a negative impact on people. Now we have to think about where is the level of trade-off for that. And I'll give you a concrete example. Like, should indoor gyms be locked down or not? Obviously, there's a huge benefit in letting people work out, both for their physical health, their immunity, and their mental health. Now, the issue, of course, is like, well, I don't know, if you have 100 people that are packed in a tiny gym, they're breathing really hard, is that going to create a contagion situation? Yeah, probably. So it's probably not a great idea, and maybe it is justified for a small non-circulated gym to at least restrict the number of people that are going, or have a system, for instance, like Equinox here in LA, when it was open at least for a week, they like limited to like, I forgot what it was, 25 people at a time, to have enough social distancing, masks were required. It seemed like it was possible to work. So that's the nuance. I don't think it's a should or shouldn't. It's a question of how, right? Another example though is, I live out here in Santa Monica. There's an outdoor gym area, right? They're just like bars, dip stations, etc., that are really popular. It's the original Muscle Beach before it moved to Venice Beach. It's completely outdoors. It's well circulated, and it's in bright sunshine, which we know is like UV actually, kills viruses and bacteria. I would say in that instance, and especially a lot of the guys who were working out there were wearing gloves, so it's not like there's a contamination effect anyway from using the equipment. It's a very low likelihood compared to the gym. Unfortunately, the city of LA actually decided to lock down the entire area. I used to go outside and like do pull-ups there. To me, that's probably a little bit overstretching, right? Where it's like, outdoor exercise, probably lower risk than a small, contained space. So these are the nuances that I think we need to grapple with, rather than having black and white policies and just say, open everything, let people run amok, and close down everything, and there's no subtlety or nuance. The hard part of public policy and science is to say, okay, let's look at the data, right? Is there a difference between indoor and outdoor? What's the amount of space? What's the level of people that we feel comfortable with? There's going to be an arbitrary distinction, right? Just like 16-year-olds we decided are mature enough to drive. Is there science behind that? Maybe, but it's at some point you make your best guess, right? And it's the same thing that I think we have to do as a society and as a public health, institutions, is to make our best guess is what we think is a reasonable trade-off for the benefit of obviously COVID containment, but also for mental health, society's well-being as well. And so that's my basic argument is, let's not be black and white. Let's live in the gray. Let's have nuance. Let's have it be data-driven, and get feedback from people in terms of what works. And the other thing too is, because we're scientists, you can essentially do real-world randomized controlled trials. Right now, there's obviously ethics behind that, and we have to think about, like, we're not experimenting on people. But you can, in certain, for instance, areas, say, okay, let's experiment with limited gym openings and see how it does. If a lot of people don't get contaminated, then maybe we can expand it, right? There was a previous example of this. It wasn't sort of done by intent, but I think there were two hairdressers that happened to have COVID, and then but they were seeing clients, right? And they were looking at the rate of transmission. I think they were probably wearing masks because it was during the COVID era. But like, I think none of their clients out of like over 100, essentially, even though they were positive, obtained COVID. So it provided some interesting real world data, for instance, is saying like, okay, even in close quarters, perhaps with mass, these folks were asymptomatic. Obviously, they didn't know, otherwise they weren't trying to get their clients sick. The rate of transmission is low. So when you have that kind of evidence, I think it can inform policy and say, okay, well, maybe for certain service-oriented professionals, hairdressers, barbers, et cetera, we can have some openings, but these are the restrictions that you need to take. So, I mean, that's my point of view. I think the reality is like, look, we have to do what's effective. We have to do what works, and also takes into the bigger picture of account of mental health and obviously the effect that it's having on our economy as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you've kind of jumped into the nuance there and kind of gone into a bit more of the detail, because what you're seeing a lot is kind of, again, the extremity. And I don't know whether this is just 2020 or the world at the minute. Everyone's either extreme one way, extreme the other. And actually the middle ground in not just political opinions, but also within, like science and potentially like opening up a gym is potentially where we're going to find like the best potential outcome of what we need to do. For it, which I think is super interesting. Another thing that I wanted to kind of touch on was masculinity, because I know that that's a big topic that you cover and you're big on tonic masculinity. Firstly, Cameron, do you think toxic masculinity exists, and what's your view on that?
Yeah, no, I actually take a very strong point of view that I think there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. So let me explain what that means though, is because I'm a psychologist, right? So we don't blame people and say, oh, okay, like imagine that like you're a couple and you're dealing with your partner, and then you're saying like you're a bad person. That's obviously not going to be an effective means of communication. You target the behavior and say, hey, boyfriend, when I walked into the room and you made a snide comment that hurt my feelings, and this is not sort of the typical loving relationship that we have. So I'd appreciate it when I walk in after a long day of work, that we keep it a little bit more positive for the few minutes, right? So you don't blame the person, you target the behavior. This is like basic like couples therapy that we sort of teach people. It's the same thing with masculinity, right? The phrase toxic masculinity has been I would say, misused to imply that there's something toxic about masculinity in and of itself. There's something about male virtues, or at least what were virtues, that are considered inappropriate to teach young boys. And we know this because, unfortunately, the American Psychological Association, which is the organization a lot of my colleagues, and in fact is responsible for a lot of the training programs of myself and my colleagues, said that traits like stoicism, aggression, competitiveness are negative things. Where, as opposed to what we were talking about earlier, like these things are on a spectrum, right? Like obviously, like physical aggression and violence is not a good thing, but in the context of sports, it can certainly be a good thing. Obviously, if you're following within the rules. Same thing with stoicism. We're not talking about emotional suppression, but learning how to manage your emotions and deal with them in an appropriate context. It may not be useful to express them to your boss or a manager at work, right? It's like knowing when it's the appropriate time and place. And same thing, competitiveness. Like we're in a competitive society. I don't think you can raise a boy or a man and not equip them and realize that, like, look, you're going to be judged by what you do by society. If you're trying to marry someone, people unfortunately will judge you by your job, your income, your status in society, whether people look up to you. This is natural social hierarchical evolution, right? And so I think we're doing a disservice by denying these things versus saying, yes, there are toxic behaviors, right? Obviously, sexual harassment, sexual violence are real issues that we need to address, and absolutely we should. And we should admonish and obviously punish people who are engaging in those things. But it's not because they're male, or it's not because of masculinity in and of itself. In fact, I would argue that a lot of men who engage in inappropriate behavior are actually enacting an immature masculinity. They haven't actually been initiated into a mature, full, robust masculinity, because unfortunately, a lot of times they didn't have positive male role models, right? 50% of marriages, unfortunately, in the US end in divorce. A lot of people's dads were, quite frankly, missing from their homes. They're raised by single mothers, or their parents or their dad left after the divorce, or the dad was so married to his job that you got your dad's temper instead of his temperament, right? When he came home at the end of the day. And so you didn't get that positive male guidance. And especially in the United States, where it's very tied into the nuclear family unit, There's not as much of the extended family, the relatives, the uncles, the cousins that you see in especially a lot of other cultures, where even if your dad was missing, or maybe quite frankly, unfortunately, he wasn't a great role model, you at least had other positive masculine role models that you could learn from. That's why I really do think it takes a village to raise a child. It was never meant to be done just like riding on the shoulders of one man. And so, in fact, if you look at a lot of traditional cultures, there's initiation rituals and ceremonies when you go from being a boy to a man. And it wasn't done by the father. It was done by older members of the community, right? The wise village elders, the uncles, the people who weren't even related to you, right? This is like your Boy Scout leader, right? Who was like, okay, let me teach you how to build a fire and like camp and do other things to survive, right? So I think that's what's missing in modern society increasingly these days. And that's why you're seeing this acting out, you're seeing this bad behavior. But the way that we treat that is we don't slander masculinity and make men feel bad for being men, right? And we know this, by the way, because nobody calls bad behavior that women do toxic femininity, right?
Yeah.
Even though we know women do bad shit all the time. It's different, right? Women are more passive aggressive, right? They bully people, through gossip and rumors in school. Men do more physical, obviously, bullying. And engage in that way, but it's no less harmful. People obviously commit suicide, unfortunately, nowadays because of bullying and increasingly cyberbullying. So it's no less pernicious, but it's not because they're women, or it's not because of toxic femininity. It's because of poor child rearing, expression of underlying psychological issues, etc. Right. So I think we need to move away from this whole toxic masculinity model. Say yes, there are toxic. I don't even like the word toxic, by the way. They're pathological, unhelpful, problematic behaviors, probably is the best term, that we need to address. But we need to address the root cause of those things. And for oftentimes, it's whether it's in the context of obviously clinical care or kind of fixing our communities, that's the best way to address it. So what we've been doing is, first of all, I almost feel like we need to reclaim masculinity. That's kind of my point of view, which is, in my point of view, masculinity and femininity are both positive forces for good in the world in their mature forms, right? Because a mature masculinity I like to say there's kind of four elements of it, right? There's four sort of classical masculine virtues. One is strength, right? So when we're talking about violence, obviously you can use your strength to beat up on someone. That's not mature masculinity. That's immature masculinity. That's a classic bully, right? But strength used for good, we post videos using the hashtag tonic masculinity on Twitter to show men literally rescuing children, dogs, people from burning fires. And that's using your God-given, physical strength for good. Courage is a great example, right? Like that's a classic. Men are admired for their courage, right? When you're jumping into a raging river, and rescuing that poor dog that's about to be swept away. That's a great example of where masculinity can be a good thing. Mastery is a classic thing, right? We admire people who exhibit a great deal of skill or artistry, or they're like the top of their field in some way. And we should, right? Because that's what people aspire to. So these are I think classical male virtues, and we use sort of tonic masculinity, tonic meaning healing, to show that true masculinity in its mature form is a positive, it's a net benefit to society, right? Because we have these great girl dads, like for instance, like Kobe Bryant, and how he was with his daughter Gigi, and who unfortunately passed away, to show that this is what good masculinity and femininity can look like. So we're reclaiming it, we're rebranding it, and saying like, look, this is what we're going for. This is what we want to grow into. And then we're using the communities as a way of getting guys to that point, right? My whole thesis is self-improvement is never meant to be done alone, right? This is a very like individualistic American thing, right? Back in the day, if you were trying to improve, you had a group, you had a gang, you had a community, you had a tribe, you had a village, you had other people in your back that are helping you in this effort. And so that's what we're trying to bring back. And we have these online communities. They're on Discord, Facebook, and Reddit. Anyone can join. They're free. And if you're working on something, you can do it with social support and accountability. I'll give you two concrete examples. We launched a channel, if you join our Discord, called Overcome October. And some people might have heard this term, Sober October. But we wanted to make it not just about quitting drinking. If there's a bad habit that you want to overcome, you come in and you make a public proclamation to the group and say, hey man, I want to quit whatever it is. I want to quit vaping, right? Because I have this bad Juul or nicotine vaping habit and I just want to get rid of it. So there's guys in there that are quitting smoking right now in our group, but there's daily accountability. They'll be like, yeah, man, seven days in, I relapse. This is what happened. This is my trigger. Someone else will be like, yeah, I quit smoking. This is what I do when I relapse. Like don't beat yourself up about it. It takes about 8 attempts for the average smoker to quit. It's part of the process. Just get back on it. And people feel better, right? And they're more likely to stick to it. We know that from the research. So that's an example. The other one I started for fun, which is a little bit more positively oriented. I started at 9 hours of sleep challenge, which is saying, like people should be sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night on average. That's what the science says, depending on your level of physical activity. We're kind of pushing it to the further extreme and saying like for people who are really physically active, let's try to get as much sleep as possible because sleep obviously is tantamount important. So every morning or every day we check in, and whoever slept the most that day, that's like the sleep king, as we like to call it, make it a little bit fun, a little bit competitive. Like I said, competition can be used in a healthy way, right? Not to like beat people out, but to push other people to be their best. That's healthy competition. So that's a fun little challenge that we're doing there as well. And so that's an example of, I think, using masculinity for good, is like guys helping other guys be their best, be the best man that they can be. And I think that's the huge opportunity that we have, not just as a company and to promote what we're doing, but quite frankly, as a society, right? We know that public shaming, guilting people are not good motivators. The psychology is well aware of that, right? The way that you get people to change is you make people feel good about themselves. They feel self-accepting, that you are whole, complete, and good as a human being, even if you have behaviors that need to change, right? That's the paradox of what I call radical acceptance and radical accountability. You have to accept yourself for who you are. You are a worthwhile human being. And you have to take radical responsibility of improving your behavior. Yes, we all have to be better. Men have to be better, for women, for society, for the collective good of the future of this planet. But we don't do that by slandering, making people feel bad or sort of living in the shadows.
I absolutely agree with that. Some awesome points there. And I think you're right. There are healthy types of aggression. There are unhealthy types of aggression. And it goes for any other type of behavior. And it is about how you kind of frame that with men, right? If you encourage it, if you tell them this is good, you create a competitive environment that is encouraging, that promotes them to do well, they are going to want to promote good behaviors. If you shame them and you tell them that they're bad, they're going to either decide to carry on with that toxic behavior or whatever it is, or they're going to regress into some other behaviors like passive aggression or being manipulative or adopting some other kind of behavior that they think will help them cope with this. And you're right. I think what you're doing is incredible. And you said there the four kind of types of masculinity, or the four different pillars. And a really good book that I've read is King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, which you've probably read as well. And this is fantastic, talking about kind of the mature and the immature masculine, but also for the fact that men can also be dynamic. And I think that it's really important to know that you can be in touch with kind of that feminine side of you, right? And I think a lot of men just, and you see it a lot on the Twitter red pill community, that is kind of like, I need to be this masculine, like go get a guy that was with all these girls and I can show no emotion. But actually the most interesting people that I've met and kind of the most dynamic are the guys that have a broad range of skills, right? That have that king element to them, that have that social, fun, open aspect to them, that have that gorilla, I can train like an animal part to them, and then also that chilled, relaxed, hey, I'm pretty zen type of guy. And if you can kind of tick all those boxes, like, I think again you're a good addition to society. You're better in your relationships, you're funner to be around, and you just make for a better and happier person, right?
Totally. And this is, by the way, one of my favorite topics, because it's actually like so intellectually interesting and mind blowing, because I can talk about it from a physiological, psychological, and even spiritual level, right? So let's start with the physiology, because people are sort of unfortunately uninformed. Both men and women have multiple hormones and sex hormones that we have both of, right? So men have both testosterone and estradiol, amongst other estrogens in their system. Now, the ratio of that is we have much more testosterone than we do estrogens. And same thing with women. Women have much more estrogen than you have testosterone, but we have both, right? So literally, in your physiological imprint, you literally have the hormones that are more masculine and more feminine within you, right? So I think on a biological basis, it shows us that we have both a masculine and a feminine within us. And the other thing, but this is the part that I think goes to the psychological level. Unfortunately, a lot of people think masculinity and femininity are on a spectrum, right? That you're either masculine or you're really feminine. And if I become less masculine, I become more feminine or vice versa. It's not true at all. Like if you think, remember physiologically, these are separate markers, right? Now they're correlated, I would say, right? If you're higher in testosterone, guess where estradiol comes from? It comes from the breakdown of testosterone. It gets broken down by an enzyme called aromatase into estradiol, right? So that's, by the way, that's like also a beautiful kind of example of science or nature at work. The feminine hormone literally comes from the masculine hormone. It's broken down into it, right? Which just shows you how inextricably intertwined our masculinity and femininity are. Now, if you measure these in the blood, these levels, though, they're independent of one another. Just like psychologically, I would argue masculinity and femininity are independent of one another, even if they're correlated. Meaning you can be high in masculinity and high in femininity. You can be low in masculinity, you can be low in femininity, or you can be high, low, or low, high. Now, if you realize that these are orthogonal or separate constructs, then I think you can become a little bit more secure in your masculinity and your femininity because you realize it's not a trade-off, right? I can be a warrior poet, right? I can be like this super jacked, what phenotypically or on the external surface looks like a hypermasculine male, but still engage in poetry, be emotionally sensitive, be empathic, be a considerate listener, a good partner, and it doesn't come at the trade-off of the more, brute force kind of, or at least physical strength or masculinity. And same thing as a woman, right? You can be very feminine, right? With like the at least the classical stereotypical qualities of, caring, nurturing, kind-hearted, soft. But at the same time, when you need to be, or when it's useful, you can certainly have more masculine elements of certainly like being strong, being courageous, having mastery in your field, being an honorable kind of person, right? They're not exclusively masculine, nor are they exclusively feminine virtues, right? We can have both. And I would argue to your point about king, warrior, magician, lover, a complete man has developed sort of the full versions of all four of those archetypes, or you can even just call them simply parts of yourself, right? In fact, I would argue if you look at a lot of the influencers, quite frankly, out in society are popular because they're almost like pure versions of certain archetypes. Great examples like David Goggins and Jocko Willink. They're really fun influencers. They're like pure warrior, hyper masculine archetype, right? Like it's like exactly who you want to listen to. You want to have more motivation in your life because it reminds you of your high school coach that's like, get up at 4 a.m, go work out every day. It pumps you up. I enjoy listening to them. I think they're great. But on the other hand, it's like, do I want dating advice from David Goggins or Jocko? Like, probably not, right?
Yeah.
They don't have enough of the feminine to be like, okay, like how do I deal with my girlfriend that I love and I've been in a relationship for a year? Maybe Jocko, because he is married and has a kid, can provide a little bit more of that. But that's not the energy that they give off. It's not the thoughtfulness, right? And then I'll give you a corollary example. Jordan Peterson, another great influencer, he's like pure magician energy. He is such an intellectual, like me, he's a psychologist professor. But it's such on an intellectual level where it's like he's the wise father that everyone wishes they had, right? That provides that paternal guidance, and it's like, yes, like guide me through finding my way in life, right? But it's like, do you want workout tips from Jordan Peterson? Probably not. He's not super jacked himself, and I'm not sure he's that role model, right? So what I think people have done is they gravitate towards that which they need, right? The people who want the paternal figure, they want the intellectual personal growth, they gravitate toward Jordan. The people who are like, I want motivation, I want to get pumped, I listen to David and Jocko, right? But I think within us, right, because you can go to 4 different coaches, you can go to 4 different influencers, but within us, you have to integrate all these different parts of you, the masculine, the feminine, the king, the warrior, the magician, lover, because if you're going to be a complete robust and resilient human being, you have to develop all of these parts of yourself. So I very much recommend the book. I think it's one of my favorite books, by the way. I recommend everyone read it. It's written by Doug Gillette and Robert Moore, who's a Jungian analyst that comes out of the Jungian psychology tradition. I know it's a little esoteric, but the way that I would think about it is, I wouldn't say it's an empirical book, like this has been validated by scientific studies, but I do think it's based on robust psychological theory and it's useful. right? Like, is there these four archetypes? Are there only four archetypes? Maybe, maybe not, right? They're arbitrary distinctions that we've drawn. But are they useful ways of thinking about it? Yes, because I would argue there are four at least values that are common, right? If you think about king archetype or energy, it's essentially leadership. You need to be the leader or CEO of yourself. And someone always, men and women need to develop that capacity. The warrior archetype, what is that? Think about it as like your physical health, right? You need to develop your physical and your mental health, and you need to take action. That the warrior is an active kind of energy and archetype so that it gets away from procrastination, get out of your head and into your life. The magician, it's like your career, right? Like, where is your creativity, your career, your intellectual development, your professional development? That's obviously an aspect of life that you need to work on, right? And then the lover, which is like relationships. All of us need both, friendships and intimate relationships, and that's another area of your life that you should absolutely work on. So whether you use the king, warrior, magician, lover titles, or you believe in them as energies or archetypes, or if you just talk about leadership, health, career, and relationships, I don't think anyone can make an argument around there. So I think holistic development needs to address multiple areas, and doesn't have to come exclusively just to be in a masculine versus feminine kind of way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, again, going back to that gray area of a spectrum of actually going a little bit deeper into who you are and the different facets that you have available to you, which everybody has a lot. Amazing. And finally, I just wanted to touch on a little bit around optimal performance, because I myself work with some CTOs, some hedge fund managers for health and body transformations, which is awesome. The guys crushed it. And I know you do some work with optimal performance. So what, in your eyes, does optimal performance mean?
Yeah, so I'll give a little context. So typically, when you go to a psychologist or a physician, quite honestly, like a psychiatrist or any other type of physician, it's usually because you have a problem, right? You only go when you have a deficit. I'm struggling with a mental health issue. I'm struggling with a physical issue, and help me solve that. I fortunately, I think that's been pushed by managed care, where insurance only wants to pay for it if there is a clinically significant problem, as we said. But the nice thing about psychology and also about private practice is, look, you can kind of do what you want within sort of ethical guidelines, right? So I would say the way that I've set up my practice is it's not so pathology oriented. I would say at least 80% of my clients do not have any mental health issues. I don't position myself as doing mental health treatment. Obviously, I am a licensed mental health practitioner. And of course, if you have depression or anxiety, or you develop it over the course of our work together, yeah, we'll treat it. And I'm obviously competent and able to do so. But the reason people come to me is because they're usually tech CEOs or VCs, I would say, just because I've lived and worked in Silicon Valley for most of my career, so that's the people that I'm around, right? And that's the people who know me. They just want to be more effective, right? They have large companies to run. They have like firms investing hundreds of millions of dollars. They want to be more effective, and they want to do it with less stress, right? And so the same techniques that you're using, which is like ACT or whatever framework that you're working on, working with, can be used in the positive. So for instance, a lot of the work that I do is this sort of, I work on what I call the 5 foundational health behaviors, right? I help people optimize their nutrition, right? They may not have like even weight to lose, but they're like, I don't know, I feel sluggish. I got to work like 10, 12 hours a day. How can I keep my energy levels high, without, my blood sugar crashing all throughout the day? Physical activity, right? So a lot of these guys are going to the gym, but they're sitting in front of Zoom like we are for like 8 to 10, 12 hours a day. And so how can I break up that, introduce some low intensity, steady state activity to give their, just like we were talking about with intermittent fasting, dopamine fasting, with physical like breaks and walking as well, so that they can regain, metabolic flexibility as well. So we talked about diet, we talked about exercise, sleep, right? Sleep is totally underappreciated, right? And unfortunately in corporate America, there's this like bravado around not working really hard and not sleeping. It's total nonsense, right? I always say, like, look at the professional athletes. They're trying to get 8, 10 hours of sleep. LeBron talks about sleeping 12 hours sometimes in order to have physiologic recovery. I argue CEOs are high performance athletes as well. They need probably more sleep because of the amount of mental load that they're engaging in. So we do a lot of sleep optimization work, including improving the quality of their sleeps with supplements as needed. Focus and attention are huge things. So dopamine fasting is one example of an effort, but obviously if they're dealing with issues around, procrastination, getting started, being able to sustain their attention, using techniques around that. And then finally, I really do think relationships and intimacy is the fifth or final sort of health pillar. You can't just be isolated alone in quarantine, working by yourself as the lone coder or engineer or investor, whatever it is that you're doing. Gallup shows that we need to be around people for at least 5 hours a day for optimal well-being. And so it's incorporating research elements like that and figuring out how to do that actually fits into their lives, so they can not just obviously avoid depression and anxiety or being overweight or sedentary, but to have rich, meaningful, fulfilling lives, and to be particularly fit, to be optimal, to be performing at a high level, and to look, feel, and perform their best. So I think it's fundamentally an orientation or philosophy, right? And that informs essentially the type of work and the intervention that we're doing as part of our practice.
That's amazing. That's awesome. And I agree with all of those points that you've made there. That's great. We're out of time now, but
Yeah.
Cameron, thank you for coming on today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And before we kind of round off, do you want to kind of tell people a little bit around where they can find out about Maximus Tribe, follow you, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, go to our website. It's bemaximus.com, bemaximus.com. There's a link on there to the communities. We have a whole bunch. We're on every single social media. Discord's our main channel, but we have groups on Facebook and Reddit, and we're obviously active on Twitter and Instagram as well. You can also follow me personally as well. I'm Dr. Sepah, DrSepah, on Twitter and other social media, and I'm always happy to engage with anyone who has any questions after the show.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, again, thank you very much, Cameron. And if you're ever in London or if I'm ever in your way, we'll have to go for a
LA.
coffee. Yeah, we'll
Yep,
have
for
to go for
sure.
a coffee for sure.
All
Awesome.
right, man.
Take
Thank you
care.
very much.